Hi, I'm Olivia, and in this video, I'm gonna be going through Module 1, where we went through, the idea of literary realism, uh, with the authors Mark Twain and Ambrose Bierce. Um, I'm gonna go through and hit each point, with each author and, talk about realism some and talk about some of the stories. So, to start with, um, literary realism, it focuses on portraying life, like, honestly, and, portraying life honestly and accurately, um, and without exaggerating anything or romanticizing events that happens in life, uh, whenever we use literary realism. And instead of heroic figures or um idealized endings, realism writers, whenever writers use it, they focus on everyday events, everyday people, like realistic dialogue that would happen and realistic social conditions that would just make sense whenever writing stories and stuff. So, and both Mark Twain and Ambrose Bierce, they both use realism, but they do it in very different ways in each of their stories. And so I'm gonna compare them because whenever you look through it and compare them, it's really interesting, like to see the differences between them. Um, I want to start though, like talking some more about literary realism because that's the main focus of this. Um, Literary realism, it it's an attempt to like really show life as it is and the reality that it's truly seen as. Um, and going back to the reading we did for this module and the video, realist writers, they avoid fantasies, realities, they avoid miracles, unrealistic plots and stuff, but instead they focus on characters that are believable, everyday situations, and detailed like settings that make sense and you can just like picture in your head and be like, oh yeah, that's happening, that can happen. And realism, it's also it most of the time it often highlights when social classes and like different cultures, they use like authentic dialogues and stuff, and like speech patterns to like really like reflect how people talk. And the goal with realism, it's not to make look it's not trying to make life look better than it is. It's just to show it honestly, and like even when it's ugly and uncomfortable and bad. So I want to dive like deeper into how each author uses realism. So I'm gonna start with Mark Twain and his story of the notorious jumping frog of Calvareas County. Um, Mark Twain's realism, it's most evident in his use of this almost I don't know what you call it. Okay, sorry. I figured out what I was trying to say. It, um, he uses it in this like everyday language and humor in his stories. In The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, Mark Twain, he presents a story that feels like it could like realistically be told in almost like a small frontier town. The way you think of it, the narrator listens to Simon Wheeler, and Simon Wheeler is whose storytelling is like filled with exaggerated and um very like far-fetched but like believable details and like a very casual conversation tone almost. And like one of the most like clearest examples of realism in this story is the description of Jim Smiley and his frog. Um uh Sorry. I haven't figured out how to say this. I think it's Daniel. Daniel Webster, the frog. The way Whaler talks about his frog, um, like including how it's secretly weighed down with buckshot. He blends humor with a realistic like portrayal of human pride and like almost like a jinx, like trickery kind of vibe. And this moment, it reflects realism because it shows like ordinary people who try to outsmart one another, like rather than that heroic behavior that I was talking about. That like realism doesn't use that idealized behavior. And the video on Mark Twain that we watch, it points out that Mark Twain's realism, it often works like making his characters feel authentic, like rather than like polished and even like not the ideal what you would think. And even though the story it's funny, it still reflects like real human, like raw human behavior, especially with greed and competitive com competitiveness. There we go. And like deception. Twain's realism, it feels almost like lighthearted in a way, but it still captures like everyday life like honestly. And that brings me to Ambrose Bierce. I want to talk about his way of using realism now in his story, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Ambrose Bierce, he uses realism in a much like darker and like intense way. Um, in an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, realism is it's shown with this like psychological depth and like a harsh depiction of war. And unlike Twain's humor, Ambrose Bierce like his realism focuses on fear and trauma and the human mind under like extreme stress. And that story it follows the character Peyton Farquhar. I think that's right. I didn't figure that out. Um, who he appears when he's trying to escape execution and when he's running through the forest, only for the reader to discover that this entire escape happens in his mind in the moments before death. So it was all just like a depiction, like a whole made up like scenario that he was imagining. And like it was discussed in the reading and in the video too. This technique that Ambrose Bierce uses, it highlights realism by showing like how the human brain reacts to fear and like trauma. He doesn't romanticize the idea of death, and like instead he presents it. He faces it head on, and like with a sudden and like brutal and unforgiving tone, and it's just stuff like that. And the abrupt like ending, it makes it like brings realism because it rejects the idea of a happy or like a ideal like heroic escape like many stories would. Bierce's like first-hand experience as a Civil War soldier, it's shown in his writing, making the story itself like feel emotionally and like mentally real, like rather than reading through it and like just feeling like it's symbolic or just like the expected idea of it. And so I want to compare them now and give my own personal response on it, because I think both authors, they use realism, obviously. Mark Twain's work impacted me through his humor and like how relatable it can be. And Bierce's work affected me on a more like emotional level. Mark Twain made realism feel like accessible to like feel and like whenever you're reading, and like familiar, and like showed how like ordinary people behave in everyday situations. Bierce, on the other hand, it made realism feel unsettling, and it emphasized and it really showed how fragile human perception and like life can be, and how vulnerable it is for people. And I personally connected more with Bierce's story because the psychological and the mental depth that it gets into, and it refuses to soften or loosen up the idea of reality. However, I do also think Twain's use of dialect and humor, it made his characters feel real, more like raw and believable, but in a different way, because both of them are easy to see. And overall, both I think both authors demonstrate major points when using literary realism, including realistic dialogue, and like believable characters, relatable ones too, and like honest portrayal and outlook of human behavior and the human mind. Mark Twain uses humor and I don't know, universal speech, I don't really know what you call it, to reflect everyday life. And Bierce uses more psychological realism to expose harsh realities of life, like death and trauma. And together, both of their works show realism it can have so many different kinds of forms in writing and in literature, but it still remains grounded in one truth and one main point to it all. And so that is my video on Module 1. you enjoyed it. Bye. Thank you.